Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. One of the things that you can do to really lift your game in Age of Sigmar is to have a very clear plan and strategy for the range of battle plans that you will be up against during this season's General's Handbook. Believe me, having a good plan for how you're going to approach the game is what separates a good Age of Sigmar player from a really great Age of Sigmar player. So if you're new to the game and you don't have any idea what a battle plan is, this is the video for you, because we're going to go through all of the battle plans and talk a little bit more about how you can have a strategy prepared for how you approach each of these plans. But if you're a seasoned player and you're looking to lift your game, perhaps become more competitive with your games, then there'll be a lot of information in here that you can take away from. And with all of the videos that I make, the big thing about this video is for you to actually reflect and think about how you approach your game. The idea is that this video will cause you to think more deeply about how you approach your strategy for each of these battle plans. So if you're new, battle plans are essentially the missions that dictate how the game will work, and in particular how the objectives are laid out, what kind of deployment area or territory that you have, and then also the scoring mechanics. Now in 4th edition of Age of Sigmar, these battle plans have introduced a new element known as the underdog bonus. So if you're trailing behind on points, there are bonuses that you can access that are aimed to help you catch up. Now, as we go through the plans, you'll see that some of these underdog bonuses aren't really all that great, where others are absolutely amazing and are going to really do you a favor as you try and catch up on the scoring. So the General's Handbook, again, if you're new to this, the General's Handbook is released each season, and a season in Age of Sigmar lasts about 12 months. We're currently in the 24-25 season, and the current General's Handbook was released at the same time that 4th edition was released. In this General Handbook, there are 12 battle plans, and when you go to play a game of Age of Sigmar, then you select one of those battle plans that you're going to play. There's rules in there for making this a little bit more random if you wish, but essentially if you're playing a casual game with mates, then you can just simply pick one of the battle plans that you want to play. From a competitive standpoint, you will typically, if it's a 2-day tournament, you'll play 5 games. The tournament organizer will pick the 5 battle plans that you face over those 5 games. Most tournament organisers will release this information ahead of time, so you have an opportunity to plan a bit or think and reflect on how you're going to approach each of your games. But some don't, and you find this out whilst you're actually playing the tournament. Now, you'll see as we go through, some battle plans feature heavily in the tournament scene, so they are battle plans that you see in pretty much all tournaments, and other battle plans, unfortunately, are very rarely seen in the tournament scene. And as we go through, I'll mention whether they are battle plans that you're likely to see regularly in competitive gaming or battle plans that you won't see regularly in competitive gaming. So this current edition of the General's Handbook will run probably up until around July time, with a new season's General Handbook coming out in the summer. And when that comes out, we'll have a look through the battle plans, see if any of them have changed, and we'll do an update video on this. But for now, we're going to look at the battle plans for the 2024-2025 General's Handbook. So let's get into it. Okay, so we're going to start with Border War. This is a quite simple battle plan in that it has a very typical territory split along the midline and 4 objectives arranged in a star-like fashion. So, and I should say, this is one of the battle plans that is often used within the competitive gaming environment. So let's have a look at the battle plan itself. There's 4 objectives. They're arranged in a star-like fashion. There is 1 home objective in each player's territory. And then there's 2 border objectives that sit on the midline between the 2 players' territories. Scoring in this battle plan is quite simple. If you hold your home objective, you get 1 victory point. If you hold a border objective, you get 2 victory points each, so 2 for each border objective you control. And if you hold your opponent's home objective, you score 5 victory points. And then if you complete your battle tactic, you score 4 victory points. So before we go through the other battle plans, let's just quickly recap on the concept between primary and secondary scoring. So primary scoring is all about standing on circles. So these are the points that you score for controlling an objective. Secondary scoring is for completion of battle tactics. So if you complete your named battle tactic in that turn, you score victory points for your secondary scoring. And each turn you add those up and you get a maximum number of victory points that you've scored. Typically, there is a cap and you can only score 10 victory points a turn. Typically, that tends to be the standard way things are. So you get 4 from your secondary and potentially 6 from your primary. With this battle plan, obviously, as you can see through the scoring, there would be opportunity to score more than 6 if you controlled everything. For every battle plan, there tends to be a twist, and that's something that makes this battle plan slightly different. And in this battle plan, you can only score a maximum of 6 victory points from primary scoring. So even if you control every single objective, you will only score 6. Your score is capped at that 6 victory points. And then the second element to battle plans is the underdog bonus. So if you are trailing behind in points, then you may be eligible for the underdog bonus. And if you are the underdog, then one of the benefits you get in this battle plan is +1 to hit for units that have charged and are contesting the opponent's home objective. That's absolutely massive because the home objective of your opponent's worth 5 victory points. So giving your units the ability to have +1 to hit if they're trying to perhaps clear your opponent's units off that objective or essentially take control of that objective is really massive. And that's why this underdog bonus is one of the better underdog bonuses. So let's have a look at let's consider the strategy that we may want to employ with this battle plan. So I think I'll explain this a bit more in this battle plan, and then I don't have to explain it on every one of the battle plans. But the important thing to do with Age of Sigmar is before you approach the game, have a clear idea what you want to do in order to win that actual game. And I'm not saying you need to break this down into the minutiae, but you need to have a clear idea of what you want your units to do to score your maximum points. And that's really important beforehand because all elements of the game lead towards your eventual victory. And there are so many times I have lost a game and realized that I lost that game on deployment, that I deployed badly. And that was my fault. Maybe I wasn't focused that much when it happened. But it just goes to show you that if you have your clear strategy, then it will run through all elements of the game. And whether you win or lose, you're not going to get to the game and think, oh, I should have done that, or I should have done that. That might still happen, but you're not going to go, I wish I thought more about what objectives I wanted to control during deployment. The second thing when we talk about strategies is it's very difficult to give you a strategy that is applicable to every single army list. If your army list is a very aggressive Alpha Strike army list, then its strategy is going to be quite different to an army that's perhaps a slow-moving, more defensive castle army list. But there are some things that are constants across all army lists. And that constant is control of the board. So when we talk about strategy, we talk about what area of the board do we want to control, which I call a control zone. So in this battle plan, you can win if you control the 2 border objectives and your home objective. There is no way your opponent can outscore you as long as you control those 3 objectives, because they're going to be scoring 1 primary victory point and you're going to be scoring 5 primary victory points. Yes, you're not going to get the maximum victory points, but you are going to be 4 victory points ahead of your opponent just on primary. And that's what you want to aim for. So essentially, you want to establish a control zone that enables you to hold on to those 2 border objectives, but also secure your home objective. Now, dependent on the risks you're up against, if you're up against an army that has a lot of deep striking, and as we go through all of these battle plans, you will realize just how powerful deep strike is as an ability. Or if you're up against an army that has incredibly high mobility and has the ability to exploit your flanks and pressure your backfield. So when I talk about backfield, I essentially mean the area behind your main line. So you will find with Age of Sigmar that typically you will have your main line at the front of your control zone, because that's normally where the majority of the objectives are. The area behind your main line, which includes parts that you are trying to control and the areas that you can't control because you simply don't have enough resources to do that. That's the backfield. And that's the area that's incredibly prone to deep strike, because if your opponent has the ability to deep strike in with units, they're not going to deep strike them in front of your units. They're going to deep strike them behind, where they can pressure the units that perhaps you're trying to keep out of combat, or they can pressure objectives that you have less resources invested to control. So whilst you can choose to invest less resources on control of your home objective, you need to make sure that if that objective is pressured by either deep strike or units that have high mobility and flank you, that you have the ability to allocate resources to defense of that objective pretty rapidly. And if you can establish this, so you have your main control zone across your 2 border objectives and the ability to reinforce your home objective should you need to, then you're going to be in a really good place when it comes to this battle plan. The second consideration, and we'll cover this more in a minute when we look at deployment and first turn strategy, is you've got a large gap between those 2 midline objectives, those 2 border objectives. You need to prevent your opponent from having movement lanes through that. When I talk about movement lanes, what I mean is gaps that your opponent can just move through. You need to prevent them from being able to move through and threaten that home objective. Okay, so now we've got a strategy prepared in our head, and this is how I would approach this battle plan. So I would have this strategy, I'd have this plan, I'm going to control those 2 objectives and the home objective. That's what I want to do. And as long as I do that and I focus on controlling those objectives and doing my battle tactics, then I'm going to win the game. And that's pretty simply how the strategy I use applies across all of these battle plans, and we'll see in more detail. So let's move on and have a look at deployment. So the first thing you need to think about once you've got your strategy is where you're going to put your units down. And I cannot overstate this enough. It is so easy to deploy badly, muck up your own strategy, and then you're fighting against a game where you're not entirely sure what you're doing. It's all a bit chaotic. You're forgetting to do battle tactics, and then suddenly, you've lost, but you've lost badly. You've lost where you walk away from that game and go, I lost that game myself. It wasn't that my opponent outplayed me. It was that I played incredibly badly. And guess what? You're going to have lots of games like that. It happens. But if you want to reduce the likelihood of having that kind of game, then you need to make sure that your deployment pays due attention to your end game strategy. Okay. So looking at deployment, the first thing you want to do is make sure that you secure those border objectives. So you want to deploy in a way that you've got enough resources to go and take those border objectives and sit on those border objectives. So if you have very resilient units that are typically called anvils, so these will be units with decent saves, perhaps some recursion that can just sit on an objective, and it's going to take a heck of a lot for your opponent to lift them off the objective. You want to deploy them so they're ready to go and take that objective immediately in turn one. The second thing you want to do is avoid overextending. It's very easy to spread yourself incredibly thin, even with a quite compact control zone like this. You want to make sure that you have enough of coverage over the mid-board so you can zone out and prevent your opponent from utilizing movement lanes to be able to threaten that home objective. So make sure when you deploy, you don't just deploy to control the objectives, but you deploy to be able to block movement lanes. And some very high model count screening style units to sit in the middle are very good at this sort of thing. The last thing that you need to remember during deployment is to defend your home objective. This strategy is entirely based on you holding your home objective. If you lose control of your home objective, then you are going to be behind in point scoring. Assuming your opponent has their home objective, they're going to be scoring 6 victory points a turn. And if you hold the 2 border objectives, you're going to be scoring 4. So you're going to be behind only by a small number of points, but even still. The worst thing about this is that it then enables your opponent to use that as a platform to pressure your units on the border objectives. So you need to defend your home objective. Your 2 biggest risks to your home objective are deep strikes and flanking. So what you'll want to do during deployment is also ensure that you've zoned out. So deep strike typically is a number of inches away from opponent units. So you can position your units around the backfield area to ensure that if your opponent does deep strike, they're not able to immediately threaten you. And part of the tactic around this will be also using terrain to your advantage. So if you arrange your units that their deep strike distance is behind a terrain piece, well, that's brilliant, because if they can't pass through the terrain piece, then it's going to make it more difficult for them to charge you in a turn, or in some cases shoot at you if the terrain is obscuring. So you want to ensure that you've zoned out that backfield. So if your opponent does deep strike, they're not deep striking on their own terms. You're forcing them to deep strike somewhere that's suboptimal, which will mean that they're less likely to then be able to threaten your home objective. Okay, so moving on to early game strategy. Well, I divide up the strategy between early, mid and late game. It's better to think of Age of Sigmar rather than a series of turns as the early game, mid game and late game. And these phases of the game are divided up by whether there is a clear winner or not, if that makes sense. So in the early game, there's no clear winner. Everybody is essentially setting up for what will be the mid game, which is where the flip between who's going to be the more likely to win occurs. So that mid game is typically where there's quite a lot of combat. And then the late game, which is where it's pretty clear which player is going to win the game. So your early game strategy should be all about securing those border objectives. Make sure you get those objectives and you can hold on to them, but don't overcommit. You don't need to overinvest resources. They are better used to prevent your opponent from threatening your home objective. You need to watch your flanks. Because the control zone on this is quite tight, you're leaving quite a gap on your flanks that your opponent can take advantage of. So you want to make sure that your opponent can't just sneak around your flanks and start threatening your home objective. And defend your home objective. Screen and zone that home objective and the areas around it to prevent your opponent from directly threatening that home objective, securing it, and then suddenly equalizing with you on points or scoring more points than you. You need to make sure that that home objective is absolutely locked in and any threats to it are dealt with. So moving on to the mid to late game strategy, if you're ahead, now's the time to just play defensively, don't take any risks, maintain control of the board, and force your opponent into taking risks. If you're behind, now's the time to use the underdog bonus. The best way to utilize the underdog bonus is to establish a coordinated offensive push. So look at that objective, the opponent's home objective, and go, can I get a coordinated set of units so I overload that objective, I clear whatever's on it, and I take control of that objective? And you'll be able to do that with the benefit of the +1 to hit from the underdog bonus. But make sure it's coordinated. It's no good just charging in with something that's just going to sit on the objective and essentially grind through combat without taking control. You need to absolutely overload that objective so you're getting control of it. There is an option, and I urge caution here. There is an option to flip to an aggressive strategy. So if you are winning and your opponent's resources, so their number of units, models, has reduced quite significantly, then you can use this as an opportunity to press your opponent back onto their home objective or even take their home objective. But quite frankly, you don't need to. You just need to control those two border objectives and your home objective. Don't worry too much about pushing your opponent back and taking their home objective, only if you need to do that for point scoring purposes. But actually, it's just not worth it. You're better off maintaining focus on your battle tactics and ensuring that you score your battle tactics each turn. So there's some common mistakes that I see quite a bit when people play this battle plan. The first is overcommitting to the home objective. You see this a lot with aggressive armies. They feel that they want to get over the board and get to that home objective, or people just get blinded by the high victory points you get for securing that home objective. It's just not worth it. Not worth it at all. Just focus on those border objectives and your home objective. If you stretch yourself too thin, you're trying to establish a control zone that reaches from your opponent's home objective all the way to your home objective, you're just not going to have the resources. And at that point, you're just inviting your opponent to start tagging the other objectives. Undercommitting to the border is another mistake I see quite a bit. This is where people don't invest enough resources into controlling those border objectives. I see this quite a bit. It's really critical that you have enough, but it's also critical that you don't spread yourself too thin. And then the final mistake is one that we see a lot in this style of battle plan, is just leaving that home objective unguarded. People move off their home objective, they might have tagged it with a wizard hero and now move that wizard up the board to be able to get their buff spells off. If your opponent pressures that home objective and you can't take it back, then you're at risk of losing the game. So you need to make sure that at all times you've got the ability to respond to any pressure on that home objective. So I hope you enjoyed that one on that battle plan on Border War. This is the format that we're using for all the battle plans, so I'm going to move on to the next one. But if you have any questions or comments or anything that you want to know more about, then pop them down below and I'll answer. I try and answer every single comment that people leave on the videos. And if you have anything specific on this battle plan or any of the other battle plans, fire ahead with it. So let's move on. Okay, so moving on to focal points. This is, I love this battle plan. I think what makes this battle plan fun is two things. First of all, you have this step like deployment zone, so it's something quite different, and that's exciting and enjoyable. And then the second part of this is the ability to manipulate the scoring by the underdog, which I think is really cool. That feels like a good underdog bonus, where the underdog can actually manipulate the game. Seems like something fun, something that's more impactful than perhaps, as we've seen previously, just +1 to hit. Okay, so on this battle plan, there are 5 objectives, 1 central objective, 1 home objective in each player's territory, and then a flank objective along the midline. Scoring for this battle plan is quite simple. It's hold 1 for 1 victory point, hold 2 for 1 victory point, hold more for 1 victory point. And if you hold 2 or more home and or flank objectives, which is quite a mouthful, then you score 3 victory points. And then 4 victory points for completing your battle tactic. The twist with this is the underdog can turn the central objective into either a home objective or a flank objective for the purposes of scoring, which is cool. You can manipulate the scoring either in your favor or potentially against your opponent. But it's a really cool little underdog bonus. I think they should do more of this. Okay, so this is the first of the battle plans where you have a number of different strategies. So I tend to look at this with 2 strategies in mind, the Control 3 and the Control 4 strategy. So we'll start with the Control 3 strategy. This is based off you controlling the central objective, one of the flank objectives, and your home objective. So you're not going to max out your primary scoring, but you can win, because you are going to score more than your opponent each turn. The benefit of this strategy is it's kind of a smaller control zone, although arguably when we look at the Control 4, maybe not. It's a smaller control zone, so you need less resource distribution. You can better protect against flanking and screening. If you get your control zone right, you reduce the space that your opponent can flank through, which is really beneficial. And you have less of the backfield area that you need to screen against. And particularly when you start layering terrain, you suddenly have quite a limited amount of space that your opponent can deep strike in, which is why the Control 3 is actually quite a sound strategy if you're, for example, worried about deep strike or high mobility armies. Then this is one way of preventing them from taking advantage. The other strategy is a Control 4 strategy. So on this one, you're looking to hold the 3 central objectives and your home objective. The benefit of this strategy is that essentially it sets you up for a very early aggressive pressure. So if you deploy like this, take your objectives, then you can pressure your opponent. And if you've got the mobility, you can potentially pin your opponent in turn 1 or turn 2, which means your opponent has less mobility, less likely to threaten your objectives, and they're going to find it more difficult to score their battle tactics. It also means you're scoring maximum victory points each turn, which is of huge benefit if you want to make sure that you're well ahead on the primary scoring. The problems with this is that it does open up the flanks quite extensively to being taken advantage of. Your opponent can charge you around the flanks. Your opponent can threaten with a big backfield area for deep striking. So whilst this strategy has its pros, I typically lean more towards the Control 3 strategy just because I think it's a bit more flexible of different army types. And I guess that's where you make your decision. And there's 2 places you make your decision whether it's a Control 3 or a Control 4. The first is when you know what army you're up against. So if you know if you're going to be facing a lot of deep strike or high mobility. And then the second is during deployment. A number of times I've gone into deployment thinking, right, I'm going to go with the control 3. I've seen how my opponents started deploying and gone, oh, actually, I'll go for a control 4. I think they'll be better. And I guess this just brings in the layer of complexity you can get to. Winning a game of Age of Sigmar, preparation is absolutely key. So if you are better prepared for each of your games, you're going to stand a better chance of winning them. So let's look at deployment. Okay, so first of all, decide whether you're going with a control 3 or a control 4 strategy. And then you need to decide whether you're going to be aggressive or defensive. So if you have the opportunity because of your army type and you can pin your opponent in their deployment zone, go for it. If you haven't, then you're looking pretty much at a defensive strategy. So you want to make sure that you deploy in a way that you can cap your 3 or 4 objectives straight away, hold on to those objectives, and then essentially also determine whether you're going to pin your opponent into their deployment zone or not, or just sit there and hold those objectives. In terms of strategy, the first thing is to establish your control zone, ensure that you've got enough control on your objectives to hold them, and make sure there's no way that your opponent can exploit movement lanes to pressure your home objective. You'll want to screen off objectives where possible. So whilst you're holding the objectives, if you screen off, you're forcing the combat to occur off the objective, which is beneficial to you if you control that objective, because it makes it more difficult for your opponent to take control away from you. And then finally, just zone the backfield and flanks. Make sure that your opponent cannot get around the flanks or into the backfield. And whether you go with a 3 or a 4 control strategy, you're going to win if you follow all of this and ensure that this is set up and occurs. So your mid to late game is to then think, well, what do I do? Do I go aggressive? If you go aggressive, you have to be clear that you are going to pin your opponent and stop them from pressuring your objectives and taking control. Or you can go defensive, and that's absolutely fine. You sit on your objectives, you defend them, you grind out the win, and that's entirely legitimate. And then the final thing is battle tactics. So it's very easy to lose focus on the secondary. If you are so focused on your primary scoring, whether to go for an aggressive pin, whether to stay defensive, that's less focus on your battle tactics, and you need to score your battle tactics every turn. And it's not just about scoring your battle tactics, it's about what you can do to deny your opponent from either scoring their battle tactic or getting easy to score battle tactics. Okay, so the common mistakes with this battle plan, first of all, people going aggressive too early. Don't overcommit to an early aggressive charge into enemy territory. Secure your objectives and then reevaluate. Unless your army archetype is an alpha pin army archetype, in which case, ignore that. Aggressively try and pin your opponent in. If you don't, then you probably lose the game, but that's what you expect to do with that army. Don't fall prone to deep strike. Deep strike is a real threat. You need to make sure you've zoned strategically. And then finally, battle tactics. It's so easy to forget about battle tactics, to burn through easy battle tactics in the first 2 turns, and then be left with difficult battle tactics in the last couple of turns. Make sure that you have a clear plan of your 5 battle tactics that you want to try and do each of the turns, and that you have a plan in order to achieve them. Okay, so Starstrike. This is, I don't know what the phrase is, perhaps this is the battle plan nobody ever asked for, but the battle plan we deserve. So Starstrike is an incredibly fun battle plan, but it's a battle plan you probably won't see all that often in the competitive environment. It's very rare to see this in a competitive tournament. That's probably because it has a high level of random to it, But yeah, it's a really fun battle plan. I love playing this battle plan, but I've only ever played it in friendly games with mates or at the gaming club. I've never come across this in a competitive environment. That's not to say it isn't used. It is used in some tournaments, but it's just not as extensive as some of the other battle plans. So let's have a look at it. And Starstrike is incredibly unusual due to its weird objective placement. So objectives arrive in turns, and when they do arrive, there is a random element to where they land. So after deployment, when the turn is starting, the active player is determined. The active player rolls 2d6, and then that determines where on the midline that one objective will land, which is kind of cool. You know it's going to be on the midline. You just don't know where on the midline it's going to be. And that's what that dice roll enables you to do. I think that's really cool. I think we should have more battle plans like this, because I think they're fun, they're engaging. They really do add an element of random to the game. But that's how it works. And then in turn 3, 2 more objectives arrive, one in each player's territory, with the same random dice roll for where they arrive exactly along the 11-inch line on the short edge of the battlefield from the deployment edge. So what happens when these objectives arrive? Well, there's a couple of things. If they land wholly or partially on a faction terrain piece, that faction terrain piece is destroyed along with any units that are garrisoned within it. Okay, that's the first thing. If it's any other terrain, that terrain feature is turned into an impact crater, similarly with the faction terrain, and units that are on that, either wholly or partially on that terrain feature, suffer d6 mortal wounds. So the easiest thing is to just not be there when the objective arrives. But this is really critical to remember, because some faction terrain has the ability to garrison units in it. So I'm thinking of the Flesh Eater Courts terrain, the Moorpot for the Ogre Moor tribes. You garrison a unit within that terrain. And if that terrain is in the strike zone and it gets hit by a falling objective, that's it, it's gone, and the unit. So the easiest thing is to just not put your terrain in a location that it could probably get essentially hit by one of these objectives. Scoring is fairly simple. Hold 1 for 3 victory points, hold more for 3 victory points. You can see how scoring is based on the fact that for the first couple of turns, you've only got one objective. And if you complete your battle tactic, you get 4 victory points. The underdog bonus is an interesting one. So when the objective arrives, then the active player has to roll the dice for the mortal damage that's applied to the unit. And they roll it for their units and the opponent's units. If you're the underdog, you can force them to re-roll it. What I would say is that, yes, this is quite nice. It adds in an element of damage mitigation. You could look at it and go, well, you know, it was 50-50 whether you were going to get 4 or more wounds or less than 4 wounds, and you've got 4 or more, so I'll get you to re-roll it and see if we can get below that. But actually, you shouldn't be in this situation, because you should just not have your units anywhere near there, quite frankly. So the underdog bonus is a bit... I would have preferred to see something more around being able to manipulate the score, or perhaps being able to force the active player to re-roll the dice for where the objectives land. I think that would have been pretty cool. But this is the underdog bonus. I just don't think it's all that great. Okay, so let's have a think about strategy. There are 2 different games here, if I'm being honest. There is the game you play when there's one objective, and there's the game you play when there's 3 objectives. So for the first 2 turns, you're essentially fighting over that singular objective. So you need to win control of that objective and stop your opponent from controlling it. That's your main focus, because that's going to get you 6 victory points each turn. The second part of the strategy is mobility. And this battle plan really does reward mobility. So you want to position your mobile units so they're ready to take control of those second cluster of objectives when they arrive. So you want your units to be positioned in a way that as soon as those objectives arrive, and let's be clear, that's both the one that lands in your territory and the one that lands in your opponent's territory, you want to take control of those immediately. You want to be in control once they've landed. And then the third part of your strategy is mobility. You need your mobile units to be out there doing their thing. You can't have your mobile units bogged down in combat, because if they're bogged down in combat, you're essentially losing that critical mobility edge. So make sure your mobile units are ready to get there and tag objectives when they land. So for deployment, for the first 2 turns, you want to make sure you have enough resources to hold on to that first objective and retain control of that first objective. You also need to ensure that you are able to capitalize on when the second pair of objectives land. So you're ready to take control of those when they do land. Second thing in deployment is do not put yourself in a position where you're at risk of the impact damage from a falling objective. So the objectives land on the midline, which you won't be able to deploy on anyway, but they also land from the later turns in a 3-inch zone from the 11-inch line. So make sure that you're not putting your faction terrain in that zone and that your units are keeping out of that zone. Because if they're in that zone, they're potentially at risk of being hit by the objective. You need to control that first objective. You can almost consider sacrificing a little bit on being able to control later objectives by making sure you control that first objective. And that's critical. You need to be scoring maximum victory points for those first 2 turns, just in case mobility stings you and you're not able to contest the second bunch of objectives. You need to build up that victory point lead. Okay, so let's look at strategy. Strategy in the early game is all about controlling that one objective, positioning for the next objectives. You need to be ready. And then finally, make sure you do your battle tactics. The problem with these kind of battle plans is that they are so chaotic. There's so much going on that it's easy to neglect and forget to do your battle tactics. You need to keep your focus on those battle tactics and make sure you're scoring them each turn. Mid to late game, it's now all about securing those 2 new objectives. Make sure you lock those objectives in straight away. Continue to dominate on the first objective. Remember, your opponent is also going to have to try and commit resources to taking those objectives off you, so they're going to be potentially undercommitting on that first objective. And then finally, I can't say it enough, focus on your battle tactics. Score those battle tactics every turn. Deny your opponent where possible. You're going to get a good win on this battle plan. In terms of mistakes, the biggest ones are being reactive, not proactive. So reacting to the objectives dropping rather than being proactive and ready. The second mistake is sitting in impact zones. No matter how many times I tell you it's easy, people do it and it happens. You can play some sneaky tricks by screening in such a way that your opponent is in the impact zone, but you're not. I mean, it's open to chance whether the objective falls on them, but you know, you can do that if you want to, but I think that takes the focus away from the battle tactics scoring, but it's an option that's open to you. And then second risk is just over focusing on that first objective. Then the opponent takes the other two objectives, then suddenly you're being outscored by your opponent. So you need to make sure that your plan in the mid to late game is all about controlling all three objectives. Okay, so moving on to shifting objectives. This is a battle plan that again is used quite a bit in the competitive tournament scene. It's a really interesting battle plan. It's essentially arranged as 3 objectives across the midline, numbered 1, 2, and 3. It'll become more apparent why they're numbered in a minute. But what makes this battle plan really interesting is this very tight and constricted control deployment zone or territory that is in the opposite edges of the battlefield. Okay, so you have 3 objectives numbered 1, 2, and 3. In any given turn, one of those objectives is the primary objective, and they're worth more victory points than the other 2 objectives. So scoring on this is really simple. If you hold a secondary objective, you get 1 victory point each. If you hold the primary objective, you get 2 victory points. And if you hold more than your opponent, you get 2 victory points. And then, of course, the standard 4 victory points you can get for completing a battle tactic. The twist with this battle plan is that the active player rolls a d3, and that determines which of the 3 objectives is the primary objective. The underdog, which is, again, all right, the underdog bonus is they can force you to re-roll that dice. I think that's a bit, crap, if I'm being honest. I would have much preferred that the underdog can pick rather than can force a re-roll. I think that would be a much better underdog bonus and wouldn't be that broken, but it is what it is. You can force the re-roll. So the strategy with this is really simple. Just control all 3. You can win the game by controlling 2. That will give you enough of a victory point lead, but you really want to control 3, so you lock in that win. There's not that much distance between the objectives, so controlling 3 should be a reasonable strategy, but you can win just by controlling 2. You need to make sure that no matter which strategy you go with, you defend those objectives and you've got control over those objectives. If you think you cannot put enough resources across 3 objectives, just go with 2. Don't stretch yourself too thin, because your opponent will capitalize on that and start taking control of objectives and pressuring your undercommitment on other objectives. So deployment-wise, you want to position for objective control. Deploy to move and take control of those objectives straight away. Deep strike is a real threat, as it is with all battle plans, but with this, because you've got such a large backfield area, it's easy for your opponent to deep strike in there and start causing you problems. And flanking is also an issue because there's quite a wide gap that units can move through and cause you pressures and unfavorable matchups. So you need to protect the flank. You need to ensure that deep striking doesn't pressure you too easily, and either hold your 2 or 3 objectives and grind out that win. So early game strategy is hold the objectives, whether it's 2 or 3. Board control, establish that board control and ensure that your opponent can't take advantage. And then with all battle plans, score your battle tactics. Make sure each turn you're getting your battle tactics locked in and you'll be on course to win the game. Mid to late game, you want to look a little bit more on denying your opponent's battle tactics if possible. This is a game or battle plan where once you've set up, assuming you've got control over your objectives, you need less focus on your primary because it's locked. You essentially, as long as you don't lose too many resources, then you're pretty much in a situation where essentially you're just grinding out the win. So you've got a little bit more sort of mental capacity, cognitive space to be able to think more about not just scoring your battle tactics, but denying your opponent from scoring their battle tactics. Don't take risks. That's the biggest thing. If you have got control over 2 objectives, fine. Don't take the risk. As long as you score your battle tactics, you're going to win the game. Okay, so the common mistakes are being too aggressive. You don't need to be too aggressive with this unless, of course, your army archetype is an aggressive Alpha Strike pin list, as we've said before, in which case ignore all of this. You need to just get across the board and pin. In fact, if your army is an aggressive Alpha Strike pin style army, then I'd probably argue you don't really need that much of a strategy going into each game. Your strategy is to pin your opponent in their deployment zone every game. You can figure out controlling objectives after that. The second mistake is not zoning, people not zoning properly and being susceptible to deep striking and flanking, and then that puts pressure on them, and then suddenly their control over those objectives starts to waver. And then battle tactics, make sure you score them. Some battle tactics are going to be more difficult to score due to the limited size of the territories. So those battle tactics that rely on something being wholly within an opponent's territory, there's less options for that. So make sure that you have a clear idea of the battle tactics you can score with this battle plan, because the worst thing in the world is to pick a battle tactic that actually is going to be nigh on impossible to score because you haven't thought that far ahead. So make sure you have a good think about your battle tactics that you can use. Okay, Feral Foray is another battle plan that's used reasonably frequently in the competitive scene. It's a really fun battle plan. I enjoy this battle plan. I think you will enjoy this battle plan too. So it's made up of 6 objectives, 3 in each player's territory, which we call their home objectives. Scoring's really simple. You hold 1 for 2 victory points, you hold 2 for 2 victory points, and you hold more for 2 victory points, and then 4 victory points for completing your battle tactic. The twist with this battle plan is that you can raid an objective in enemy territory that you control. If you raid that objective, it can't be controlled or contested that turn. So essentially, you can switch off an objective in your opponent's territory that you control, which, you know, you may choose to do, but actually you're controlling it, so you're scoring points from it. The underdog bonus is that they can do this with an objective they contest. That's incredibly powerful. So as long as you contest an objective in your opponent's territory, you can switch that off. So you can stop your opponent from scoring victory points from that objective, which is really quite big. So what's your strategy? Well, your strategy here is essentially you want to hold all of your home objectives and 1 enemy objective. If you do that, you win the game on primary points. This is a big risk because essentially, if you have a look, this creates a huge control zone of essentially half the board, where you're looking to pressure your opponent's objectives, but also prevent your opponent from pressurizing your home objectives. Your opponent is going to look as much as possible to exploit any weaknesses from this. So you need to make sure you've got your mobile units that you can rapidly get across the board to stop your opponent from putting too much pressure on those home objectives. And then you also need to be prepared for the underdog. So if your opponent switches off one of your objectives, say in your home territory, you need to be able to ensure that you're still outscoring your opponent. So if that's a risk, you need to be prepared to perhaps take 2 of your opponent's objectives rather than 1. So let's have a look at deployment. You're going to want to deploy in a way that you can get aggressively across the board and push into your opponent's territory. You're going to need to zone as per usual, your home objectives, and you're going to need to deploy for positional battle tactics. So you're going to want to make sure that in your first 2 turns, you've got some easy positional battle tactics that you can score, and you know that you're coming out with maximum secondary points each turn, because it's going to potentially be very close on the primary points. So your early game strategy is to be aggressive, push into your opponent's territory and challenge their objectives as early as possible. As usual, protect the backfield and flanks, and as usual, lock in those early battle tactics. As the game moves from mid to late game, it switches to being more about a containment. You want to contain your opponent to prevent your opponent from tagging your home objectives and exploiting the underdog bonus. You need to protect those home objectives, and you need to complete your battle tactics, and where possible, deny your opponent scoring their battle tactics. So the mistakes with this are simple: overcommitting to offense, putting too much on the aggression and not enough to ensure that your home objectives are secured. And then the kind of opposite to this is undercommitting on an opponent objective. So you only need one of those objectives. So pick the weakest one and overload that objective with resources. So your opponent can't control that objective. You're in control, and it's going to take a lot to shift your control away. So you only need that one objective that you can focus on. Okay, so Jaws of Gallet. I love this battle plan. It is a battle plan that has a combination of interesting deployment territory and objective manipulation mechanics. And I love battle plans that have that combination, because I think they're fun, they're interesting, they get you to think differently about how you play this. So for Jaws of Gallet, you have 2 deployment zones. They're an L-shaped deployment zone, which is quite unusual, and they're located on opposite corners of the board. You also have 5 objectives, so 1 central objective in neutral territory, and then 2 what we'll call border objectives or home objectives that are located on each player's territory, or the border of each player's territory. Scoring in this battle plan is really simple. Hold 1 for 2 victory points, hold 2 for 2 victory points, hold more for 2 victory points, and then 4 for the battle tactic. The twist with this battle plan is that from the second battle round onwards, the underdog at the end of their turn, after they've scored their victory points, can pick 1 objective anywhere on the board and remove that objective from play. If there's no underdog, no objectives are removed. So they don't have to do this, they can do this, but this is a massive underdog bonus, because you don't have to contest or control that objective, you can just remove that objective. And I think that's really cool. I think that's a really, really good underdog bonus. Okay, so with this battle plan, your strategy, if you can do it, is to pin your opponent in their deployment zone. So you want to get across the board, pin your opponent in their deployment zone, and start threatening their home objectives. You win this game by controlling 3 objectives, and that includes, though, if one of your objectives gets removed, you need to control one of your opponent's objectives. So you control 3 objectives. So if you're a slow moving army, you've not quite have that ability to aggressively get across the board quickly, then your focus or control zone should be more around the central objective. That's where you're looking to be, because you want the fight to be in that area or as close to your opponent's territory as possible. You want to win that fight and then steamroller your opponent and get on to their objectives. The big critical part of this strategy is to plan for objective removal. So when it comes into play, and it will take a little while potentially to come into play, you need to be ready for, if your opponent takes one of your objectives, how you're going to still control 3 objectives. And you need to be able to do that. Okay, so deployment. Maximize first turn mobility as much as possible. You almost want your units to be on the starting blocks ready to go. You want to get them across the board as fast as possible and as far as possible. Zone your backfield, because again, your opponent can flank around you or can deep strike and pressure those home objectives. And if you're slow, focus on your home objectives and that central objective. You can grind out a win with just those three, but it's going to be more difficult than if you can push your opponent back and threaten their home objectives. So the early game strategy is to be aggressive. Be as aggressive as possible and ensure you can contain your opponent within their territory. Secure the home and central objectives. Make sure you've got those secure and they're not prone to deep strike or flanking. And then there's a lot going on with this battle plan. Focus on your battle tactics. If you can deny your opponent scoring battle tactics, it's critical, because every battle tactic you deny your opponent gives you more resilience and flexibility if you start dropping points in the primary game. So make sure that any opportunity you have to deny your opponent from scoring their battle tactics, you can use that to your advantage. So mid to late game, lock in that primary. Make sure that you're winning the primary game, that you've got that locked in, and that you are ready to control your opponent's objectives should they start taking away some of your objectives. Defend the home and central objectives. Protect your home and central objectives from your opponent, and then prepare for objective removal. Make sure you have a clear plan for maximizing the primary score should objectives start to get removed from play. So the common mistakes with this battle plan are not protecting the backfield. You need to get the balance right between offense and defense, not controlling opponent objectives. So you focus on controlling one objective, that's a problem. You need to have that ability that if you have your objectives being removed, you can tag one of your opponent's objectives. And ignoring battle tactics. Look, I accept that this is a very complex battle plan. A lot of your focus is going to be on the primary. Don't lose focus on the secondary. Score those battle tactics. Deny your opponent from scoring where you can. Okay, so Battle for the Pass, another battle plan that gets used quite a bit within the competitive scene. This is quite a frequently used battle plan, so let's get into it. So in this battle plan, there are the two territories are divided up, and you have the 4 objectives arranged in a star-like fashion, 1 objective in each player's territory, so a home objective for each player, and then 2 objectives on the midline, which we'll call the border objectives. So scoring is quite simple. You get 1 victory point for your home objective, 2 victory points for each border objective, and 5 victory points for your opponent's home objective, and then 4 victory points for scoring your battle tactic. Now, if you've done the maths, you could see that this goes above 10 victory points. The twist for this battle plan is an inbuilt scoring cap, so you can't score more than 6 victory points from the primary. The underdog bonus is the player who is the underdog gets to add 2 to control scores of friendly non-hero units. It's all right. It's not ridiculous. It's not awful. It's all right. So let's have a look at what we plan to do with this. So your strategy with this battle plan is to control 3 objectives. Control both border objectives and your home objective, and you win. It's as simple as that. As long as you can protect that home objective and as long as you can score your battle tactics. So that's your strategy. Hold those 3 objectives, score your battle tactics, win the game. So during deployment, your first focus is on ensuring you can secure those border objectives. That's the first thing. Remember, though, that there is quite a big gap between the 2 border objectives. So if you haven't screened properly, then your opponent's just going to take advantage of movement lanes, move through, and start pressurizing your home objective. So you need to ensure that you've got a good screen set up. You need to zone your backfield, which is quite a large area, so you've got quite a big risk there. And you need to protect your flanks from being flanked by opponents' units. Your early game strategy is to control your border objectives early. Focus on securing those objectives and maximizing your scoring potential. You want to pressure your opponent's midline control. If the fight is just at those 2 border objectives, brilliant. Because if it's there, they're not pressurizing your home objective. And also make sure your opponent doesn't opportunistically steal your home objective. So mid to late game, you still want to make sure you're holding on to your border objectives, defend your home objectives, grind out that win, score your battle tactics, and you will win the game. So common mistakes are to ignore the twists, so people see the victory points for the home objective and pressurize their opponent's home objective. You don't need that. Don't worry about it. Neglecting the midline objectives, they put less control on the midline objectives, then it's easy for the opponent to take them off and to overcommit to offense. Just putting too much into pushing up early and trying to take the opponent's home objective, you can just pretty much ignore that home objective. In fact, it's probably beneficial to ignore it, because then your opponent might be less likely to take all their resources off it. Okay, so Scorched Earth. I love this battle plan. I love any battle plan where there's a progressive reduction in the number of objectives over the battle plan, but this one is great fun. So this battle plan starts with 8 objectives. So normally you have a maximum of 6. This one has 8. So if you've only got 6 objectives, time to get those scissors out and a bit of cardboard and make yourself another bunch of 2 more objectives. 4 objectives in each player's territory. Scoring is the simple scoring. Hold 1 for 2 victory points, 2 for 2 victory points, more for 2 victory points, and then 4 victory points for completing the battle tactic. The twist is what makes this battle plan really big fun. So from the second battle round onward, at the end of their turn, the active player can pick 1 objective wholly within enemy territory that they control and is being contested by any of their units. That objective is then removed from play. I think that's cool. That's really cool. It gets even better when you look at the underdog bonus. At the start of each battle round, the player who is the underdog can choose 1 objective in their territory that they control, and until the end of the battle round, they subtract 5 from the control scores of enemy units contesting that objective. So essentially, the underdog can almost prevent that without a huge investment of resources. So they can prevent you from taking away their objectives whilst also taking away your objectives. I think that's really cool. I think that's a really good underdog bonus. Okay, so what's the strategy with this? Be aggressive. You need to get across the board quickly. You need to pressure your opponent's home objectives as quickly as possible. You need to control when the objectives are removed and use the twist to shape the battlefield and limit your opponent from trying to reduce your scoring too much. And you want to force your opponent to spread thin. Threaten multiple objectives, which means they have to defend across all of them, not just 1 or 2. So for deployment, you need to balance. You need a balance between offense and defense. As much as you need to be aggressive and start threatening your opponent's home objectives, you also need to defend your home objectives. Mobility in this battle plan is absolutely crucial. So you need your mobile units to not get bogged down in combat. You want them out there being able to tag objectives and score your battle tactics. And then you need to be prepared for aggressive moves by the opponent to remove as many of your objectives as possible. and be able to counter by getting control of their home objectives as quickly as possible. Your early game strategy: control your home objectives, pressure your opponent's home objectives, set up your defense to prevent your opponent from putting pressure on your home objectives. That's the plan. That's what you're doing in the early game. In the mid to late game, it's all about defending your remaining objectives. Don't give your opponent the opportunity to contest and potentially remove. You want to make sure the fight's occurring off your home objectives. You want to make sure that you're controlling your opponent's objectives. Make sure that you're on them and you're controlling them. If you have the opportunity, really pin your opponent into their home territory, because that way they're causing you less pressure on your objectives. So common mistakes are ignoring the twist, overcommitting to offense, and neglecting that mobility. If you fall foul of any of these, then you're going to run the risk of losing. You need to absolutely focus in this battle plan. It's all about limiting your opponent's opportunity to remove your home objectives, whilst putting pressure on as many of your opponent's home objectives as possible. Okay, so the better part of Valour, another battle plan that appears quite a lot in the competitive scene. This battle plan has 6 objectives, 3 in each player's territory, with the sort of standard territory arrangement. Scoring's really simple. It's hold 1 for 2 victory points, hold 2 for 2 victory points, hold more for 2 victory points, and then 4 victory points for completing the battle tactic. The twist in this battle plan is whenever a friendly non-hero unit destroys an enemy unit contesting the same objective with a this is a mouthful, with a fight ability, that friendly unit gains the dominant keyword. So what does the dominant keyword mean? Well, dominant is a bit of a blessing and a curse. Dominant units get +10 to their control score, which is massive, as long as they continue to contest that objective. The negative is that the underdog's army gets +1 to hit against dominant units, which is, that's quite a big thing, quite a big downside. So dominant is a bit of I think it's a bit iffy. If you've got control, you've got control. The +10 is massive, and it's going to be difficult to take control off you again. But is it worth being +1 to hit against? Not entirely sure that it is. You would be better committing some more resources and not being +1 to hit for your opponent's army. So I think this is, I'm not a massive fan of this underdog bonus, if I'm being honest, because I think that it is such a good underdog bonus that your opponent is not going to put themselves in a situation where you get to use it. Okay, so what's the strategy? Be aggressive, focus on controlling multiple objectives early on. Make sure you control your opponent's objectives, protect your home objectives, and make sure you score your battle tactics. Pretty simple strategy there. So when you deploy, defensive positioning is really critical. You need to ensure that your objectives remain controlled while maintaining flexibility to contest others. You need to pay attention to mobility. If your opponent has a fast army, they could contest your objectives much earlier than you expect. And you need to decide which units you're going to hold back slightly to defend your home objectives, and which units are going to form part of the aggressive push to get control of your opponent's objectives. So early game, you'll tag your home objectives on deployment, and you want to move across as quick as possible, pressure your opponent's home objectives, whilst also ensuring that you've zoned and protected against deep striking or opportunistic flank attacks. Your mid to late game, be aggressive. Really push your opponent back on their objectives. Target the weaker objectives and take control of them, whilst defending your home objectives and ensuring that you don't lose those, because if you lose those, you could potentially lose the game. and focus on your battle tactics. Score your battle tactics. Don't get over focused on the primary. Make sure you've got enough focus on the secondary and scoring your battle tactics. So the two common mistakes are overcommitting to the offense and neglecting objective control. If you make these mistakes, you can maybe rectify them slightly. But if you overcommit to offense and your opponent manages to threaten your home objectives, then you're going to face a difficult time to try and claw back with the win. And definitely do not neglect objective control. You need to make sure that if your opponent has weaker objectives, that you get control of those objectives. Okay, the Vice. Again, a really fun, chaotic battle plan. Great battle plan, and I think this does appear in the competitive environment reasonably regularly, but it's just a great battle plan to play with mates. So the way the Vice works is at the start of the game there are 4 objectives, one located in the corner of each board, or each corner of the board, and then the objectives start to shift and then eventually end up with one objective in the center for the last 2 turns. Scoring's really simple. Hold 1 for 2 victory points, hold 2 for 2 victory points, hold more for 2 victory points, and then complete your battle tactic for 4 victory points. There's a little extra inbuilt scoring for the final 2 turns where there's only 1 objective. You can still maximize the primary because you get 2 victory points if there are no enemy units within 6 inches of the central objective. The twist with this battle plan is the shift. So at the start of turn 2, the objectives shift to the 2nd position, and at the start of turn 4, objectives shift into a single central objective. The underdog gets to pick 1 objective, and they can deal D3 mortals to each enemy unit contesting that objective. That's pretty cool, because being able to grind down the units a little bit by doing these D3 mortals is kind of fun. It's not amazing, but it's not bad at all. Okay, so deployment considerations. You need to deploy for where the objectives are going to be. So you need a very minimal deployment on the corner objectives in your territory because it's unlikely your opponent's threatening them. If you have mobility, consider threatening your opponent's corner objectives. But you don't need to at this point. Focus on just getting control of those first objectives. And then positioning to be able to take control of the objectives when they shift. That's both your territory objectives and your opponent's territory objectives. And then also be prepared for what happens when there's only 1 objective in the center and it just becomes a fight out for that objective. So your early game strategy is to capture your home corner objectives, but don't overcommit, and contest your enemy objectives if you can, but don't overinvest in that. If it's a big risk, don't take the risk. Just focus on your objectives. Mid to late game, you need to be proactive rather than reactive. So make sure that you're positioned ready to take control of the objectives when they shift and get ready for the fight at the central objective. And then also, it's really critical to remember there is so much going on, the chaos of all of this. Don't forget your battle tactics. Make sure you're scoring your battle tactics and exploit any opportunity to deny your opponent scoring their battle tactics. So common mistakes are not properly preparing for the objective shift. Make sure that you're ready for that. Overcommitting to the corners and not having been prepared for the big fight at the center. At that point, you're just fighting over the 1 objective. So be prepared to fight hard and control that objective. Okay, so close to the chest. This is another battle plan that's used in the competitive scene fairly regularly. So it has an interesting deployment zone. It's kind of a connected L shape that you have for your territory. It has 6 objectives, 3, let's just call them 3 in each player's territory really, and we'll call those the home objectives. Scoring is quite simple. Hold 1 for 1 victory point, hold 2 for 1 victory point, hold more for 2 victory points, hold the primary for 2 victory points, and 4 victory points for completing the battle tactic. The twist with this is that the opponent selects one objective in their territory to be the primary, and the underdog on a 5-up dice roll can force the opponent to select a different primary. I mean, that just seems crap, let's be honest. It would be much better if the underdog could just pick the primary. I think that would be a much more reasonable underdog bonus. So with this, you can control, as long as you control your 3 and one of your opponents, then you can grind out the win. So I like to try and stretch my control like this. It's a big stretch, so you might want to think more carefully about perhaps controlling your 3, pushing up to the midline, and then maybe trying to take, with a smaller resource investment, trying to take the opponent's objective that's closer to your territory. So strategy: deploy to cover all 3 home objectives and ensure consistent scoring. Use fast units or deep strike to contest opponent objectives, and pressure the primary objective to force your opponent to overcommit on resources. Towards the mid to late game, you want to start aggressively pushing into your opponent's territory and forcing them away from their objectives whilst defending your home objectives and making sure that your opponent doesn't flank or deep strike. Common mistakes are neglecting the primary. You need to make sure that you're aware of which objective is the primary, overcommitting to offense and ignoring the underdog. Always be prepared for what happens if the primary changes. Okay, so the final battle plan, and I know this is my favorite of all of the battle plans. Limited resource is such a strategic battle plan that often you win or lose this game based on your strategy and your deployment. So limited resources has 6 objectives, 2 objectives in each player's home territory, 2 objectives along the midline that we'll call the midline or border objectives. Scoring's quite simple. Hold 1 for 2 victory points, hold 2 for 2 victory points, hold more for 2 victory points, and 4 victory points for completing the battle tactic. The twist with this battle plan is what makes it really fun. When you start controlling an objective, you can only score victory points from that objective for a maximum of 2 turns. You can continue to contest it beyond those 2 turns, but you can't score points from controlling it. So you can deny your opponent scoring points, but you can't score points. The underdog bonus is that they get +3 control score of friendly units contesting an objective that they can score points from. Okay, so deployment. There's a couple of things in here. The first thing to be aware of is if you deploy on an objective, you begin the timer for the maximum number of turns you can score, because you begin the game controlling that objective. So my advice to you is don't deploy on your home objective, whatever you do. You want to save your home objectives for later scoring. The strategy I apply to this is I want to control the 2 mid-board objectives for the first 2 turns. If I do this properly and prevent my opponent from flanking, or deep striking, then they are forced to control in their home objectives, and you've got the advantage there. And the reason you've got the advantage is that you've got your early game, set up to control those midline objectives. You have your 2 turns of controlling those, your opponent's controlling their home objectives. When it gets into the mid to late game, so those objectives no longer give you points, you've got 2 options of where to go. You can either push forward and pin your opponent and start controlling their home objectives, or you can tag your home objectives and start controlling those. So you have a lot of flexibility in that mid to late game, and your opponent has less flexibility because their only option at that point is to either push you off the midline objectives or to threaten your home objectives. And if you have properly defended your home territory, then their option is to just try and push you off the midline objectives, in which case, brilliant. You can commit a very tiny amount of resources to come back, tow your home objective, establish control, and then move on. So the mistakes that I see with this is people deploying on their home objectives, burning those home objectives too early, overcommitting, trying to take on too many objectives, ignoring the underdog mechanics, and make sure that you know that your opponent, if they're the underdog, is getting additions to their control score. And then poor mobility. You need to have the mobility to be able to pivot towards objectives as the game progresses. Okay, so thank you very much. If you've got to this point, fantastic. Thank you for listening. I hope this video was really useful. There's a couple of things I want to say on this video and a little bit wider. The last month has seen an absolutely unprecedented level of support for the channel and the videos. We have seen a astronomical increase in the number of views, the watch time, the number of subscribers, and that's been massive. And from the depths of my heart, I love all of you for the support you've given, the interaction you're giving to the videos, and for your support of the channel. It has been absolutely massive. It's given me a second wind, encouraged me to create more content. I want to make content that's useful for you. When I look at the content, I think, what sort of content would I have liked when I first got into Age of Sigmar? And that's the type of content I want to create. But that's dependent on you telling me the type of content. I know a number of you have commented on videos you'd like to see, and I've made notes of all of those. But please carry on doing that, because I want to make content that's useful for you and that you enjoy watching. But I really do want to reinforce how grateful I am of all the support. And that goes with this video. So if you found this video useful, please give us a like, put some comments on there. All of this helps get the video and the channel better seen out there in the community. If there's anything you'd like to see, chuck it down in a comment. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe, hit that notification, and then you will get notified as new content is released. So thank you very much. Till next time, I hope you have a positive hobby journey. Bye for now.